Thank you, Kevin, for doing that again tonight. All right. What is the name of the missionary we have been reading about? Isaiah. Oh, that's the one we've been doing on Sunday on the other ones. What's tonight, Zach? David Livingstone. Yes. What country does David Livingstone want to go to be a missionary? Elijah. China. Is there a problem with that plan? Zach? Or your name is Silas. Silas. Huh? Yeah, but what's the problem? Oh, he doesn't know what the problem is. He just knows that yes is probably a good answer. Oh, Sam's excited. Yes, Sam, what's the problem?
Britain sold China drugs and now China won't let anybody use their bad.
Very good, and well succinct. Very good. The Opium War is going on in China and Britain. They're having this big fight. China's not letting anybody in. Well, they're sort of not letting anybody in. They're shooting British people. So, not a good time to be there. So, the last thing we heard from David Livingstone is the London Missionary Society says, well, where do you want to go? And he says, I don't know. Where am I going to go? So here he is without a plan. So let's see what God has in store for David Livingstone starting now. David Livingstone sat at the dinner table in the Aldersgate Street boarding house where he was staying. Seated opposite him was Reverend Robert Moffat, the missionary he had heard speak at Exeter Hall with Prince Albert. The Reverend Moffat was a missionary in southern Africa and was making his first trip home with his family in 20 years. He was staying in the boarding house while in London to meet the directors of the London Missionary Society. David had been a little confused by some of the things Reverend Moffat had said at the meeting at Exeter Hall. He decided to ask him for some clarification. All right, just a little word of reminder. In the previous chapter, David had gone to hear a speech by the new prince of the time. His name was Prince Albert. They were Britain was sending an expedition off into Africa, and Robert Moffat had been speaking there also, talking about Africa. So that's the reference in case you're not remembering that part. All right? Reverend Moffat, he began, all I have read about Africa would lead me to believe that it is populated only around the edges, and that the middle is a huge, unpopulated wilderness. Yet you speak as if there are people living deep inland, as well as on the coast. What makes you think that? The Reverend Moffat put down his fork and began to speak in his strong Scottish accent, which hadn't diminished one bit since, despite all his years in Africa. I don't think it, laddie. I know it. And he did not say it in a Midwest accent. He said it in a Scottish accent, which I don't have. So, anyhow, I don't think it. I know it. I know the popular view is that the center of Africa is a wasteland, but that's only because no white man has ventured inland. But I can tell you this. Some mornings I have got up and looked towards the vast plain to the north and seen the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary has ever been. His eyes gleamed with excitement as he spoke. David sat in silence for a moment. David sat silent for a moment, taking in the enormity of what the older missionary had just told him. Africa was not empty after all. It was filled with people who needed to hear the gospel message. Before David had finished his mutton stew, he had made up his mind. He would not wait for the end of the Opium War in China. There was missionary work to be done in Africa. That's where he would go. It took several letters to the directors of the London Missionary Society for David to convince them that Africa was the right place for him. The directors were reluctant to send an inexperienced missionary to Africa, which they considered a dark and dangerous place. Indeed, the continent had been nicknamed the white man's graveyard. Still, David's persistence paid off, and David was given permission to go to Africa on one condition. After he had qualified as a doctor, he would need to be ordained also as a minister. He would also need to be ordained as a minister. David returned to Glasgow in, let's see, I'm supposed to stop here. Nope, we got time. All right, David returned to Glasgow in November 1840 to take his physician's exam, which he passed with flying colors. His family was very proud of the new Dr. Livingstone. When he returned to Shuttle Row in Blantyre to visit, David was proud of them all too. By now, his oldest brother John's lace business was booming, while younger brother Charles had immigrated to the United States and was studying to become a pastor at Oberlin College in Ohio. His sisters were also doing well. Both Janet and Agnes were teachers at a local school. With hard work and education, each of his brothers and sisters had managed to escape a lifetime of drudgery working in the cotton mills. David could spend only one night at home with his parents. He was expected back in London for his ordination ceremony at the Albion Street Chapel in 4 days. That autumn night, the Livingstone family sat up talking late into the evening. David told his parents and sisters all about London and all he knew about Africa. Just before David had left for Glasgow, the London Missionary Society had sent a letter to him informing him that he had been assigned to work at the Reverend Moffat's mission station in Kuruman. Despite the late night of talking, David awoke in the morning at 5 o'clock. The rich aroma of brewing coffee rather than tea the family normally drank filled the apartment. David's mother and father were already up and dressed. David folded the blanket he had slept under on the wooden floor and put it away, then sat down with his father to a bowl of hot porridge. It wasn't long before Janet and Agnes joined them. "David, how far is Kuruman from the coast?" asked Agnes. "It's about 600 miles inland and almost due north from Port Elizabeth in southern Africa," he replied. You will remember to write, won't you?" asked Janet anxiously. "I love the letters you send from London. When people at church ask me what you're doing and how they can pray for you, I know what to tell them." "I'll write," promised David, "though it's going to take 3 or 4 months for a letter to get from the coast of Africa to Scotland. If I go inland, goodness knows how long it'll take to hear from me." "Well, if we don't hear from you for a while, we'll just pray all the more," smiled his mother bravely as she poured David another cup of coffee. "Now tell me, what are you going to take with you? Is there anything you need?" David smiled back at his mother. Even though he was now 27 years old, she still liked to fuss over him. "According to Reverend Moffat, I'll be able to buy most of the supplies I'll need in Port Elizabeth before heading inland," he said. "Would you take the morning Bible reading for us before you go?" Mr. Livingstone asked his son, handing him the black leather-bound family Bible. David took the familiar book in both hands, as he had done so many times before. He flicked the Bible open to Psalm 121, his favorite psalm, and began to read. "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth." The final words of the psalm, "The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth, and even forevermore," were still echoing in David's mind as he set out with his father to walk to Glasgow to catch the boat to Liverpool, from where he would take a coach to London. As father and son walked along together in the still morning air, David wondered whether this was the last hour he would ever spend with his father. Neil Livingstone was 52 years old and did not look well. And although his father would not complain about his health, David noticed that he didn't have the same spring in his step as when he'd accompanied David to Glasgow to attend Anderson College 4 years before. It was a sad parting in Glasgow for David and his father. Mr. Livingstone's health was failing, and David was on his way to the white man's graveyard. Neither of them expected to see each other again. And David stood on the aft deck for a long time, watching his father disappear from view as the boat slipped down the Bromelaw and out to sea. So, who did David meet as a missionary? Who was a missionary to Africa? Who had he met while he was? Isaiah. Dr. Moffat, actually Reverend Moffat, he wasn't a doctor, but Robert Moffat, all right? So, also, what was David's favorite psalm? Huh? Psalm 121. Okay, I got kids panicking back there. All right. Psalm 121. David's going to hold on to that psalm, and we're going to roll back to it when we get done here tonight. My help comes from the Lord. We'll get there. Hold on to that. Don't forget it as we keep going. All right? So, he's headed out to sea. 2.5 weeks later, on December 8th, 1840, the Reverend Dr. David Livingstone stood on the stern of another ship. This time it was the George, a sleek, three-masted sailing ship under the command of Captain Donaldson. On board with David were William Ross and his wife, who were also on their way to be missionaries at Kuruman. In fact, William Ross had been ordained in the same ceremony as David 2 weeks before. Both men were now officially ministers with the London Missionary Society. David loved life at sea. He enjoyed the sound of the waves crashing against the bow of the ship, and he loved watching the dolphins that swam alongside. He was also fascinated by the stars and the navigation equipment that George carried. Captain Donaldson showed him how to make lunar observations at night with the quadrant and chart the position of the stars on a map. Soon, David was as accurate at this as the captain. He did not know it at the time, but it would be a skill he was glad to have in Africa. The Ross family, however, were not clamoring around on the deck. William and his wife were both very seasick for almost the entire voyage. David tended to them as best he could, but there was nothing he could do to stop the pitching and rolling of the ship that was the source of their sickness. With William Ross confined to his cabin, David became responsible for the Sunday service in the dining room. He had high hopes for the service. But, once again, he was reminded he was not a natural preacher. The few crew that attended the service were sullen and rude, and David's sermons didn't seem to grab their attention. The George was headed for Port Elizabeth with a stop in Cape Town on the way. About halfway through the voyage, something happened. Okay. We'll get back there in just a second. What two things was David doing during the voyage on the boat? What is he doing? Elijah, one of them. Okay, he is preaching. Yes. All right, Isaac. Okay, George is the name of the boat. And so, yes, he's learning things from George. Okay, no, it's okay, Zach. It's okay. All right, George is the name of the boat. All right, so they're on George, the George. I guess it's called the George, not just George. But anyhow, they're on the George. They're sailing, and he's learning things. What is he learning? Mr. Kevin had his hand up. Navigation. So it's called celestial navigation. It is actually an amazing skill. Do you understand that on a clear night when you can actually see the stars and know what you're doing, you can tell exactly where you are by the position of the stars at the right time of night? There's a good bit that goes into it, but you can actually look at the stars and they will tell you exactly where you are. Lots to do with that, but when you have no other way to reference things, okay, when you're out on the ocean, Guess what you don't have? By definition, you don't have what? Landmarks, because you're on the ocean, all right? So, out on the ocean, hugely helpful. Pilots have used celestial navigation, pilots of airplanes and pilots of boats. Maybe if you are wandering out across Africa without a map, celestial navigation might be handy. Okay, so what happens to the boat? Let's see, where were we? Oh, there it is. About halfway through the voyage, the ship was lashed by a massive storm. Captain Donaldson's stubborn determination kept the ship afloat, but when the storm finally subsided, the George had lost her main mast and most of her sails. As a result, she was at the mercy of the currents and the trade winds, which were pushing them westward towards South America. As the ship drifted helplessly across the Atlantic Ocean, David noticed a marked increase in attendance at the Sunday service, and the crew became much quieter and better behaved. Interesting, that. All right, David watched each night as Captain Donaldson took quadrant readings and plotted their new position. Each day they moved closer and closer to South America until they finally spotted land dead ahead. They were just off Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 5,000 miles and a whole continent away from their destination. Still, catch the attitude here. Still, Brazil was a mission field. Although it was not the mission field to which he had been assigned, David was eager to begin some missionary work. He unpacked a number of tracts and Bibles and disembarked the ship as soon as it docked in Rio de Janeiro. Captain Donaldson told him it would take about a week for emergency repairs to be made to the ship so that it could make its way back across the Atlantic Ocean to Cape Town. David invited William Ross to accompany him. Do you think William Ross is going to go? Okay, Nick says yes. Sam, do you think he's going to go?
I think he would be very happy to only finally.
Yes or no? Yes. Sam says yes. Okay. Isaac, do you think he's going to go? No? Why do you think he's going to not go? Okay. So you've got missionaries that were headed for Africa. They're now stuck in Brazil for a little while. But William felt too weak from all the seasickness. Beside, William protested. This is his answer. He'd signed up to be a missionary to Africa, not South America. Undeterred, David walked for many miles, talking to people and handing out tracts and Bibles. He visited many pubs and bars and talked to sailors about the gospel message. He was appalled by what he saw in these places, you think. The sailors were usually drunk and out of control, and the worst behaved of them all were British sailors. Because they set such a bad example for the local people, David was embarrassed to be from the same country as they were. A week later, the George had new sails flapping from remaining masts, and the broken railings and hatch covers had been repaired. The ship was soon headed across the Atlantic Ocean towards southern Africa. They encountered no more storms to push them off course, and early March 1841, the George arrived at Simon's Bay off Cape Town. Of course, because of the detour to South America, they arrived much later than expected. And they would be even later getting to Port Elizabeth because the ship was now going to undergo an overhaul and have a new main mast fitted in Cape Town. This would leave the three missionaries stranded in Cape Town for a month while the work on the ship was carried out. Now, What happened to the ship David was traveling on? A storm. Okay, I don't know what's up tonight. It's probably a lack of candy. But for whatever reason, my two kids are the only ones raising their hands. I'm going to need some extra input here, all right? All right. Two of my kids. I have three, by the way. That didn't sound good. My two kids. I have three. I claim all of them. All right. So they have a storm. Now, think about this for a minute. David Livingstone and the other guy's name I just lost, William Ross. David Livingstone and William Ross, they're going to do what God has called them to do, right? So in our human thinking, we expect God is going to give them favorable winds. He's going to they're just going to go zip right over there to Africa. And that's not what happens. Who controls the location and the duration and the voracity of that storm? Silas, God does. God is in absolute control of that storm, and he sends it right down on David Livingstone's ship. Tossed, crashed, broke the mast, broke other stuff. Now a sailing ship has no sails. Their only option is to keep floating and hope they have enough food to get to land before they starve. So they float over, they get to, where'd they end up in? Rio. Sorry. Somebody up here got it for you, buddy. All right, Rio. But I've got other people involved now, so this is good. They end up in Rio. Now, William Ross, stuck on this boat, seasick, been through a storm. And what does he do when he gets to Rio? Cops an attitude. Exactly. He's thinking, but God, I said I would go here, but you put me here. I'm not going to do anything here. There were a couple of times when we've studied Paul's life, his missionary journeys, he didn't end up where he was expecting to, and every time Paul just launched off into ministry. Here we've got David Livingstone, stuck in Brazil, launches off. He says, hey, I got a week. People need Jesus. Here I go. And he goes to places, honestly, rough, dark, dangerous, ugly places. But he tries. He goes and he does his best to minister. Then they finally get to their first port in Africa, and they've got to wait on a whole ship overhaul. Because in Brazil, they just got like a temporary quick fix, okay? I would assume, although it may not have been invented yet, which is a sad thing, it probably involved duct tape, okay? Duct tape a few things back together, get it, maybe they made the sails out of duct tape or something. But anyhow, they duct tape the ship back together with whatever they called duct tape back then, and off they go. So when they get to Africa, it's like, okay, now we've got to get some real repairs done, okay? So they get started doing the real repairs. Now, let's see. Work on the ship we're sharing out. All right. During their stay at Cape Town, David and the Rosses were guests at the London Missionary Society stationed there. David made himself as useful as he could, but after only a few days, he was restless. He was finally in Africa. But there was a whole unexplored continent to the north of him, and he was itching to see it all. The smoke of 1,000 villages beckoned to him to get moving inland. By contrast, William Ross and his wife were very glad to spend the month in Cape Town. After the crowded conditions of the ship, living in the mission station seemed blissful to them. They began to wonder whether God had really called them to go inland. After all, there was a lot of work to be done on the coast. William Ross discussed his feelings with David, who was astonished that any missionary would consider staying on the coast where there was so much work to be done inland. Secretly, means he didn't say it out loud, secretly he labeled men like William Ross veranda missionaries, people who didn't want to leave the comfort of their porch to venture out into the mission field. Indeed, since boarding the George, William Ross and his wife had done nothing but complain about how bad things were. David had tried to overlook their complaining because they were so sick, but now that the Rosses were having second thoughts about whether they should even be going inland as missionaries, their behavior irritated David. David began to wonder how he would ever work alongside William Ross at Kuraman. He was already sick of hearing from him about how much better things were in England. When an opening for a pastor came up in Cape Town, David privately hoped that William Ross would take the job. But much to David's chagrin, William did not. And on April 15th, 1841, all three missionaries set sail aboard the refitted George on the final leg of their sea voyage to Port Elizabeth. Now, what is the term he's using for William Ross? What name is he? What is he in his head, not out loud? Elijah. As for that's a description. That's the definition for the term. Silas, what's the term? Oh, he lost it. Wait. Haley. Veranda missionaries. Does anybody have a veranda on their house? Yeah, most of you are like, what? What? Yes, it's a front porch. So yes, you have a front porch, a back porch, a veranda, somewhere you like to sit and chill. Okay, that's the idea. Now, I will say, David Livingstone is looking at people who honestly have already gone way further than most people have. David Livingstone, in his mindset, he has one ideal for a missionary, and these guys are not meeting it. Now, I think there are some concerns with how they're approaching things, but I also think, and this is me, a little bit of personal opinion here, he's showing a little lack of grace with some of this. Now, I can't say I would have thought different if I were in his shoes, but I would be showing a lack of grace too. So, these are things we have to be thinking about. Where are we going? What are we doing? How dedicated are we? So many times people say, I want to go. I want to serve. As long as it's easy. As long as God makes all the boats go right where they're supposed to go. As long as everything works the way it's supposed to. Okay? We have missionaries sent out from our church that are working in difficult areas. Dan DeVerna, I think everybody already knows. It's not like this is like blinding news. Man, the guy struggles with the language. Go figure. It's Japanese. It's hard. Crazy hard, okay? Dan struggles with that language, and he fights, and he fights, and he fights, and he fights. But he keeps fighting, okay? We've got to keep going. Whether it's serving as missionaries or serving right here in our local church, it's not going to be easy. And some of the problems we're going to face, it's going to be clear, and this is where it's going to feel weird. God put this problem in my way. Nobody was responsible for that storm except God. God said, David, I'm going to toss this boat up, I'm going to break this boat, and I'm going to let you float 5,000 miles off course. And David said, that's okay. When I hit land, I'm going to serve. In fact, while I'm on the boat, I'm going to serve. That was the thing. Years ago, you left for the mission field and you had a month or so on a boat where you had to do stuff. Now, I'll admit, a 16-hour flight seems miserable. Now, I'll admit, I get to do less moving around on that 16-hour flight than he got to do on the boat. So, just saying. All right. Although that 767 is almost probably bigger than that boat was. But anyhow, that doesn't matter. That's beside the point. Okay. He goes. He faces trouble. What though? Here I am again. Silas, will you grab my Bible and bring it up, please? I keep coming up here with my book and not my Bible. It's in the seat right in front of you, buddy. There you go, buddy. I set it up there. Thanks, bud. Thanks. All right. What was his favorite psalm? Psalm 121. Let's pop over there tonight. We got a few minutes. Let's read that whole thing. All right? Psalm 121. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. David Livingstone's looking to this psalm. This is the psalm he turns back to. And he says, I will look to the hills. I will lift up my eyes. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. Now, he is referencing a lot of stuff that had to do with Israel and their first covenant, but the principle is the same. God is our help. The interesting part about that is, yes, God sent the storm. And yes, everyone on the ship survived. And God put David in another location for a short period of time to minister somewhere else. In fact, due to the storm and the out-of-control floating, he says more people were coming. More people on the boat were coming to hear the services. God uses different things. Our help comes from the Lord even when everything is going crazy and we're stuck in the middle of bigger problems. Okay? Whether that's here, whether it's on the mission field, whatever it is, God is our help. We're going to hear more about how things go with the team members they've got and how things progress once they get moving. But tonight, let's just remember men who were this dedicated. Even the guy he's having a problem, William Ross, he's already made a bigger investment than most of us are willing to make. And he's gone. And he's gotten there. Folks, we need to be considering, God, do you want me to go? It was Heather. It was Heather. I was just talking to Heather the other day. Reading through the book of Acts says the elders of the book of Acts are reading, fasting, praying. And then the elders of the book of Acts pointed out two guys and said, you guys, go to the mission field. How do you think that would go over in our churches if me and Mike Allen just spent a couple of days praying and then started picking and pointing and saying, go? Most churches in America, you'd get run out on a rail, I'll tell you. Okay? But how willing are we to follow God's command to go into all the world? It's an interesting deal. Interesting thing to consider. Here we are going out. God is their help. Now we're going to find out next time what he faces next and how things go as they start out across Africa. All right. Have they even got, I'm trying to think where, I read on past here, so I'm trying to remember where I stopped now. Okay. They're starting their final leg. Okay, so they haven't even made it to Port Elizabeth yet. Starting their final leg. All right. Any questions about what we've covered so far tonight? Where they're going, what they're doing, what it means to you? Mr. Nick.
Saying that because the Rosses want to go in part of it, they aren't real.
Basically, what he was saying is observing their behavior from the time they got onto the boat. Now, he understood the seasickness, they couldn't do anything about that. Okay? You're either seasick or you're not, from my understanding. All right? I've been on one ginormous boat once. It didn't bother me. It really bothered Heather. Okay? So the seasickness they couldn't do anything about. It was their, hey, we're in port for 5 days. Let's go do some missionary work. I'm called to Africa. I'm not called to Brazil. I'm not doing anything here. Then when they get there, they had been saying all along, we're going inland. We're going inland. Because you have to understand, the philosophy, okay, is to go to unreached people, is what they were trying to do. That's what everybody said they were going to go do. And now they're saying, well, we've got a whole mission station here. And yes, there's churches and there's work being done here, but we could work here too. And so instead of the missionary spirit of going inland where nobody was working already, they're wanting to stay where everybody else is already working and it's easy. That's why he's calling them, as you said, not real missionaries. And that's why I said a little ungracious, not completely inaccurate. Yes. And that's why I'm saying he was a little ungracious. That's why I'm saying that. Because yes, God needs people in all kinds of different places. But at this point, we live in a different age. I was talking about it once before. Basically, there are pockets and little places where there has not been official gospel work done. For the most part, there's not entire continents that are missing the gospel right now, okay? David Livingstone is saying you have a small group. It would be like saying, okay, Michigan has the truth of the gospel. And me saying, well, I think I'm called to be a missionary to Michigan. And even though the entire rest of the United States doesn't have the gospel, I'm called to be a missionary in Michigan, is really what's going on at that point. So, yes, if God truly wanted them there, then that's God's decision, and he would have needed to be okay with that. But again, his perspective is you got to go way on out there. You've got to go out where nobody else has gone. So, yes, that's why I'm saying I think he's being a little ungracious, but he also does have somewhat of a point. Okay? Sense? Any other questions? Mike, is that a question or comment? Go for it. Yep. Who knows? Yep. 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 He's got a plan for it. Good question. Okay. 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 We're jumping topics a little bit, but I'll jump into it just a little bit, okay? Two things I'll say. The first sounds overly harsh, but it is true. Israel is under God's judgment. And all throughout Israel's history, when Israel rejected God and God's men, God sent judgment. And that judgment was horrible. When the Babylonians came in and took everybody, they didn't just, okay, well, we're just going to take some of the people and leave. No. The only people left in Jerusalem were the old and infirm who couldn't do anything. Women and children were taken as wives or killed. Men were taken and made to serve with the eunuchs. So you understand what happened to them. This was not, the judgment on Israel has always been serious judgment. Now, that being said, the Bible also makes it clear you stand with Israel and you're in good condition. You stand against Israel and you're in serious danger. So, while I believe Israel is under God's judgment, I also believe that we as a nation need to stand with Israel and support them. Because all throughout, even into Hebrews, folks, you don't turn your back on Israel and get away with it. So, there are under horrible atrocities and terrible things are being done, and they are. The problem is Israel right now is still refusing to look to Christ, to the second coming. We have hope in that. They are still hoping he'll come the first time, which is, they've already missed that boat. So that's, again, they say we have hope in the Lord. Now, are you talking the Jews have a motto or Friends of Zion have a motto? Which one did you mean by that? The Jews. Okay. Yes, the Jews, they are still clinging to the Messiah is going to come and solve this problem. No, he came 2,000 years ago to solve their sin problem, and they didn't want it. So that's the problem Israel's in right now. Okay? Good question. Any other quick questions before we wrap up?
I should say, I think in some respects, David Livingstone was so excited to be in this. Sort of expected the others, William and David.
Mm-hmm.
And while they may have been excited to degrees, they were having.
Yep, they were struggling. They were struggling. And again, like I said, I think he's showing some lack of grace. But guess what? David Livingstone is human, just like me and you. So, yes, he was so excited, I think he's losing sight of the fact that maybe they're not as excited. All right, Silas, do you have a question? Oh, you're just, okay. All right. Anything else? All right. Mr. Gary, would you close us in prayer tonight?